Good Wednesday morning from the Moorish, Tartarian, mysterious, morbid city of St. Augustine, Florida. It is the 20th of March. Oh, it's the 20th of April. I'm so sorry. This is MedusaWasFramed, and my name is Joyce. And today I'm going to talk about one of the many historical places here in this fascinating, misrepresented city plagued by his story and water amnesia. Tolamato Cemetery, which is inside the old city limits within the first colonial gates of my city, St. Augustine. This now is a completely wrought iron gate enclosed cemetery that you could not possibly sneak into. Two reasons for that. First of all, there are marked burials that go back to the 1700s, and there are indigenous unmarked burials that go back far older than that. It is protected and maintained by the Catholic Church here, the Archdiocese of St. Augustine, as well as the Tolamato Cemetery Preservation Society. Fascinating place. It is open one Saturday a month for 4 hours, at which time freely you can come in and walk around and view the stones. There are guides available who can give you the tour. I'm not much of a tour person. I didn't take the tour. They have a lot of resources available. And if this is interesting to you, there are a lot of resources on the web as well through the Preservation Society. So some of the photos that you're going to see, I snapped myself. I have done so either through the gates when the place was closed, or last Saturday when I took advantage of the open day and walked in. And in all things, when you start investigating anything, especially an area or subject with as much history as this place, you find a lot more to research. And what you thought might have been a quick video proves very soon not to be, at least if you have a rabidly curious mind like I did. I suppose that's why I chose archaeology as a major in college, because I couldn't pinpoint one thing to focus on. And archaeology and anthropology basically encompass everything. Anyway, so let's begin. I'm going to put this baby on slideshow and let you view the photos. There are quite a few. While I start what turned into a pretty extensive story. So this is the oldest extant planned cemetery in the United States, and certainly the oldest cemetery in Florida. It's important to know that the first Franciscan friars and monks arrived in 1763. The butcher, as I unaffectionately refer to him, Hernandez de Avila, arrived in 1653, sticking his wooden cross in the beachhead south of the walled city, what became the walled city of St. Augustine, where now stands Nombre de Dios Mission and Our Lady of the Leche National Shrine, and started forcing the indigenous Timucuan to either convert to Catholicism or be killed. This after the notable imbecile Ponce de Leon supposedly first touched ground here in 1513, looking for gold and the fountain of youth. So the Franciscan monks served the indigenous population basically from their first arrival in 1573 to 1784. I think I said something wrong. I think I did a little number dyslexia, which I tend to do. I said the first Franciscans arrived in 1763. It was 1563. My apologies for that. You will see an early map slide by on the slideshow. Two, actually. One is a Spanish map showing what became the Tolamato Mission and Chapel, and then burial grounds in 1675, and another in 1705. So we know that this place, actually a larger space than we have here, which is 1 acre, was being used for funerary and religious reasons as early as 1675. Archaeology done in 2006 in the Southeast Georgia region showed that there were indigenous inhabitants as early as 1300 BCE. So Southeast Georgia. The indigenous people that lived here, the Timucua, who were noted as giants, by the way, and you will see a sketch done by the artist that traveled with the first French group of Huguenots that escaped here to escape persecution from the Catholic Church in France, drew their Jean Rebel with the Timucuan leader Saturawa, and you see that this indigenous leader is well taller than them. So 3,300 years ago, there is proof that there were people inhabiting this land, and with some decent technology. When the Spanish arrived here in the St. Augustine area, what we now call St. Augustine, though, okay, that's a whole nother story, and I've discussed that. They might have actually arrived in Georgia. But when the Spanish arrived here, as the story goes, there were 220,000 Timucua, covering 19,000 square miles, administered by 35 chieftains. 1565. By 1895, the number was down to just about 200,000. From 200,000 to 50,000, decreased to 15 chieftains. By 1700, the noted population of Timucua was only about 1,000. In 1720, the numbers were down to 250. 1726, 175 or so. 1752, there were 26 Timucua noted. And when the United States took the land that was called Spanish Florida in 1821, there were less than 10 noted Timucua. Fantastically successful genocide. The first inhabitants of the land on which this and St. Augustine and I stand were what we came to call the Timucua and the Gold. And the Gold were a Mississippian group, meaning mound builders, shell mound builders, earth mound builders, and they are known for being up on the eastern part of Georgia in what is now referred to as the Golden Isles or the Sea Isles. They are the people that encountered Jean Ribault and his folks coming in from France, which came to be called the Huguenots, the French Protestants. In 1562, Jean Ribault first brought his 5 or 6 ships of French to an area that came to be known as Charlesport in South Carolina, which is now Paris Island. And there is a tribute to Jean Ribault there. You can find out more about that in my video about Fort Clinch and Fort Caroline Star Forts, as well as read extensively about him. The Huguenots, the French refugees, are noted to have very good relations with the indigenous people, both there in what is now South Carolina, Paris Island, as well as further south here, basically Jacksonville on the St. Johns River, what became known as Fort Caroline. Fort Caroline is what remains of Fort Caroline shows as Star Fort. So the French worked with, learned from, worked alongside, and traded happily and cooperatively, it appears, with the Gold and with the Timucuan here. And of course, everything changed when the Spanish came, when the need to Catholicize the world. And specifically in this case, Avila was sent here by the king. Who was it? Was it Philippe VII, I think, maybe? I don't recall. To get rid of the French and convert or kill the indigenous. So when the Spanish got here after the French, in just a couple years later, 1565, they started setting up missions immediately in the regions of what we now call the Carolinas and Georgia, and of course, here in St. Augustine as well. The Gold tribes, the Mississippian tribes that were north of here, rebelled twice in 1597 and 1645. Unfortunately, they were very impacted, as all indigenous people were, by these ridiculous Europeans with their unfamiliar diseases and cruelty and self-righteousness. And they moved down from the Carolina region to the Fort Caroline area, or what became known as Fort Caroline, which is on the Jacksonville area along the St. Johns River, just inland a bit from the ocean on the St. Johns River, where the Timucua were already trading cooperatively with the French. In 1675, the Spanish insultingly used the term Yamase to refer to these newcomers to the area, to what was at the time still all Spanish Florida, but now is the difference between Georgia and Florida. So these new people into the Fort Caroline, therefore Florida area, they referred to them as Yamase, which they're still referred to that way today, interestingly enough. People call the indigenous of Alaska and those regions Eskimo, which is actually a very derogatory name. The word Yamase meant runaway or newcomer refugees. Sad. I just learned that while reading up on this. I didn't know that. In 1684, due to much onslaught of Indigenous rebellion and such, the Spanish and the natives abandoned all 6 missions in the region that we would now call the Carolinas. And by 1733, there were so few of the Yamasee gold in the area of coastal Georgia, southern coastal Georgia, and down into northern coastal Florida to resist Oglethorpe, the English butcher, the founder of Savannah, as we are told. There were not enough gold left in healthy enough state or in enough cohesiveness to resist, and they just left. They either went into hiding in the islands, especially moving into lands on the sea islands where the English were incapable of acclimating and are believed to be the ancestors of the people now that we call the Gullah Geechee on Sapelo Island, St. Catherine's Island, and also Cumberland Island, all places in the Golden Isles along the Georgia coast. Cumberland Island, beautiful place if you haven't been, by the way. So the first priest at Nombre de Dios, which is right across the street from my house, where the great St. Augustine cross stands, the first, we are told, Catholic establishment in the New World. Father Francisco Lopez de Mendoza, Grajales, is said to have helped erect the first cross in 1565. So that's when Catholicism started influencing Florida. I chose to use the word influencing. The first father who is noted to have used this space that we're looking at, that became known as the Tolamato Mission and Chapel, and eventually burial ground, was Father Miguel O'Reilly, an Irish gentleman born in 1752 in Ireland, and as many Irish Catholics did, managed to escape Ireland safely to study trade or seminary in Spain. He left as a young teen, got to Spain, was ordained, and was the first Spanish-speaking Irish Catholic priest in the community, and is greatly heralded since. The still standing oldest house in St. Augustine was built in 1691, and Father O'Reilly bought it in 1785. There are pictures in the slideshow of his house, which is now a museum, as well as a drawing of him that is based on a sculpture. This happened during the second Spanish period of St. Augustine and stands on the oldest street in St. Augustine, Avia, at 32 Avia Street. So he helped found what we now know as Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe de Tolamato, Our Lady of Guadalupe at Tolamato. Tolamato, we are led to believe, is actually referencing an area in northeast Florida and Georgia where the indigenous came from. The gold, specifically, the Timucua were already here. Just a little St. Augustine history. In 1690, St. Augustine built its first seawall The city lines, as they were referred to, that enclosed the colonial city at the time were built in the same time as the seawall. The Castillo, the big star fort, the Castillo San Marcos, in which there is one interesting old photograph in the slideshow, was finished in 1696, we are to believe. And reinforcements to the lines around the city started in 1705. The Cubo line was reinforced, which is the line that jets out westward from the fort, and the Rosario line in 1718, which runs parallel with the Matanzas River and runs all the way around to the south side. That's Father O'Reilly right there. And then finished enclosing the city. In 1706, an additional wall was built between the Matanzas River and the San Sebastian River, referred to as the Hornbeck, and that enclosed all of this mission property. It stood essentially where San Carlos Street is today, which, if anyone is familiar with the area, is where the traffic circle is, and also is the way that you get over to go over the Orsina Villano Bridge and head north on A1A. Father O'Reilly's home became the rectory, and before the end of his life, he willed it to the Sisters of St. Joseph, a group that were already very influential and effective in Europe, devoted to education of all, educating girls as well as boys, the importance of education at all. Father O'Reilly passed away in 1812. What may be his most noted contribution, besides the education and the giving the Sisters of St. Joseph a place to start, is he trained a 14-year-old Cuban boy for the priesthood, a gentleman by the name of Felix Varela, who was born in 1794 in Cuba and passed away 1802 in, oh, no, I'm sorry. He didn't pass away in 1802. He was educated by Father O'Reilly between 1794 and 1802. Excuse me. Father Varela is now actually on the path to sainthood, and I'll talk more about that. After his education with Father O'Reilly, he returned to Havana for seminary, was ordained in 1811 at age 23, and returned to St. Augustine in 1848. He then passed away in 1853. There we go. Sorry about the confusion. While he was in Spain, he taught in the cemetery and was elected to the Spanish legislature in 1821, same year, the first time that yellow fever hit St. Augustine. In 1823, Father Varela was one of those who voted to depose King Ferdinand VII, which brought him a death sentence. So he had to scoot. He fled to New York City, where he founded the Christ Church and the Church of the Transfiguration, which is in what we now call Chinatown. He published and edited a Catholic newspaper, considered the first journalist of the church, and lived in many New York hospitals during the cholera outbreak, attending to the victims in 1832. He published the first Spanish language newspaper in the United States. In 1887, he was named Vicar General of the Diocese of New York City when the Irish began to arrive, and he took up their cause. Should we believe that that had something to do with Father O'Reilly? Don't know. But he spent a lifetime defending the downtrodden, serving the unservable. He ultimately was buried in Tolamato Chapel. You see the chapel in some of the photos in 1853. 60 years later, his remains were actually moved back to Havana, to the University of Havana, where they stand today. So the plaque covering the hole where his tomb once lay, and there's the chapel right there, inside the chapel, still stands. And there is much commemoration of him. His beatification began in the 1980s, and he was declared venerable in 2012. A postage stamp was issued in the United States to honor him for Hispanic Heritage Month in September of 1997. Somewhere in the slideshow is his stamp. He educated women the same as men. The anathema. He stressed the importance of English and Spanish cooperation and the importance of education for all. The Felix Varela Foundation still is in operation in New York and Miami, Florida, based on education and service. Augustine Vero was born May 23rd, 1805 in La Puy, I may be saying that wrong, France. At 16, he became a priest. He joined the society of priests that educated upcoming priests. I'm probably going to say this wrong, the Sulpicians. At 25 in 1830, he was sent to Baltimore to teach at St. Mary's College, which then closed in 1852. He followed that by becoming a parish priest in Ellicott's Mills, Maryland, which I've been to, actually, a beautiful area, just stunningly beautiful area. 1587, he was appointed the Vicar Apostolic of St. Augustine. In 1861 and to 1870, he was the Bishop of the Diocese of Savannah in what was then Spanish La Florida. I'm going to sneeze, I think. Florida was handed to British rule in 1763 and through 1784. And when this happened, over 3,100 Spanish left for Cuba. Many of the indigenous were not able to leave. Some did, or some went deeper into the wilderness. But most of the Spanish friars went to Cuba. The St. Augustine Cathedral, not to be confused with the chapel at Tolamato, had been burned in 1707 by Governor Moor's attack from South Carolina. It stood burned for wood harvesting for almost 100 years because the British were not interested in Catholicism or restoring a Catholic cathedral. So those Catholics or Spaniards that did remain in St. Augustine hid their services and held them in a hospital. When Spain regained Florida in 1784, they rebuilt the new cathedral on loan from Spain, this time of coquina, the limestone, unique limestone formation we have here in the southeast on the coast of the Atlantic, that is a blending of sand and shells and calcium, that which built the first seawall. The Castillo San Marcos is the base of the cathedral, not the cathedral, the chapel in Tolamato Cemetery, the original city walls, and many, many, many of the homes that still stand in St. Augustine. In 1887, the US took ownership of Florida, and the cathedral was then burned again. On and on, but this time, because of the coquina and concrete foundation, it was easier to rebuild. This being brought up because Augustine Vero, Bishop Vero, ultimately became the bishop of the cathedral. So as I mentioned, Father Miguel O'Reilly, the priest who taught Varela, the man who was on the way to sainthood, left his home on Avia Street to the Sisters of St. Joseph. In 1866, Bishop Vero requested the first sisters from a group in his hometown of Le Puy, France, where they had been doing a lot of good work with educating all and helping teach basic skills and trades, teaching girls to tat lace and whatnot. Vero was then the Diocese of Savannah and vicar over St. Augustine. By the turn of the 20th century, the Sisters of St. Joseph, through the tutelage of Bishop Vero, had helped educate more than 50% of the Black population to read. From that came a church and dormitory school in what is now known as Lincolnville, south of what was then the colonial city gates. Remnants of that school still stand, and I did a bit about that in my Tartarian walkabout video. Church of the Moor stands next to it, a beautiful old Moorish Tartarian church, of course, and it's called Church of the Moor. Vero was a huge advocate of the Freedmen's Bureau, an organization that was formed in 1865 when Congress passed this bill to form a bureau for refugees, freedmen, and abandoned to transition from slavery to freed status. The first St. Augustine church was built in 1565. All of the churches in St. Augustine, including the chapel at Tolamato, burned numerous times. Nombre de Dios mission is the site where Avia is to have first set foot and raised the first cross. And the continuation of that is the Cathedral Basilica, which now is on King Street, with the bell tower standing well over the city. Interestingly enough, the bell tower was built of stone. Cough, cough, who built it? The chapel burned many times, but the stone bell tower remains time after time after time. Interesting. Who built the bell tower? We won't go there. Sir Francis Drake burned things down in 1586. He burned down Tolamato, he burned down the Marilla Chapel, and there it is. He burned most of the city, what he could. He burned Nombre de Dios, and he burned the cathedral at the time. In 1599, it was rebuilt of palmetto, so ferns. In 1605, Spain paid for the architects and proper timber to rebuild the cathedral. Again, as I said, in 1702, Moor attacked. In 1707, the Tolamato Chapel was rebuilt with stone, referred to as Ermita de Piedra. I probably said that wrong. Hermitage of Stone. In 1707, there was an attempt to rebuild the main cathedral on King Street, but due to mass appropriation of the money, it didn't happen. And again, 1763 to 84, the British ruled and they just didn't care. They built Protestant churches and let what was the Cathedral Basilica on King Street remain a ruin. In fact, they harvested the wood that they can to build their Protestant churches. In 1793 and through 97, the Basilica proper was constructed. 1887, burned again, one under English US control. So after all of the Spanish friars left during the English occupation, there just were not enough Catholic men to serve, or nuns to serve in St. Augustine. So when Bishop Vero came in to rule as archdiocese over the area, he raised funds from his native France to rebuild a new school and recruit religious communities and staff for the church school and to support ministering the community. And that's when St. Benedict the Moor Church and School were built. They still stand in the quote unquote bad part of town, the quote unquote black part of town. Well after Vero's death, the Sisters of St. Joseph continued to minister and educate in this school and through this church. And in 1916, Florida, embarrassingly, passed a law making it illegal for whites to teach blacks. Well, here are all these Catholic nuns continuing to teach people of all races, including blacks. And many of them were jailed for teaching. That's a whole other story. During his role as bishop, Vero guided over 8,000 Catholic souls during some of the worst times in the South, the Civil War. He was an advocate for social, moral, and religious improvements for slaves and for the Indigenous. He stated forcefully that he saw the abolition of slavery as an unprecedented opportunity for the Catholic Church to reach out to strangers to God's teaching. And a famous sermon that he gave was collected by a group who turned it into tracts and started handing it out, advocating the abolition of slavery here in the South. Oh, the rebel bishop, he became known as for that. He's responsible for incorporating Catholic schools in Savannah into the public school system while retaining their religious character. Bishop Vero died June of 1876. The rebel bishop. And there's an interesting story there. One of the many interesting stories around Tolamato Cemetery. So the 1870s, Of course, the community was distraught that he passed away. His interment was slated for Tolamato Cemetery. His body was laid out for viewing, but because it was Florida and because it was June, the preparers of the body thought it might be better to create more of a hermetically sealed viewing opportunity for people so that his rotting body didn't stink. And so that's what they did. But it was June in Florida. And as the story goes, on the day of his internment, there was a combination of the gases of his rotting body in the steaming, hermetically sealed vault with a glass top. And essentially, his coffin turned into a bomb, exploded, and covered the viewers with him. Ah, what a thought. Now, if we step back to the days of British rule, it just so happens that this mass exodus of the Spanish to Cuba and the Indigenous into the Everglades and such, or to Cuba, or to other islands, coincided with an influx of a huge group of indentured servants from further south in the area of Daytona Beach into St. Augustine. And that is what became known as the Menorcans. The Menorcan population from the Turnbull indigo plantation in what is now New Smyrna Beach. Dr. Andrew Turnbull was a Scottish physician who was living in Charleston, South Carolina. He received a land grant of 60,000 acres in what is now the cities of Edgewater and New Smyrna Beach for indigo and sugarcane plantation. Turnbull had served as British consul at Smyrna, then a busy port in Turkey's Ottoman Empire area, where he met his wife, the woman who became his Turkish wife. He named his plantation New Smyrna after the area where he served. So due to his wife's relationship and his Mediterranean contacts and politics, he was able to recruit a great many indentured workers from these impoverished areas. He recruited 1,405 people from the Mediterranean region on 9-year contracts to work his land. The journey from the Mediterranean ports where they left to the area around New Smyrna Beach would have been what was then Ponce Inlet, was 5,929 miles. 1,400 people left, 1,200 people survived. To this, he added the purchase of over 100 slaves and employed European carpenters, overseers, managers, and their families as well. Now, the problem happened when his plantation was up and running. He decided to leave it in the hands most of the time to overseers and spent time traveling between his other ventures in Charleston and often heading back and forth from Britain. At the height of his plantation's productivity, it alone had a larger population than the city of St. Augustine, which was the capital of Florida at the time. Turnbull had partners, and millions of dollars in current money value was invested in this massive plantation. If you're ever down in that portion, southern Volusia County, there's Turnbull this and Turnbull that, just the way here in St. Augustine, there's Ponce de Leon this and Menendez that and Avila this. Expansive area, interesting. Anyway, the overseers were not good people. They were cruel, they were corrupt. They wanted their bonuses for getting as much work out of these people as they could. There was graft. The people who should have been paid were not being paid. Things did not go well. And after the 9 years of service was up, in the years between 1766 and 1777, there was a great revolt. These people were now free to make a decision. Do you want to stay here, work the land on your own, or do you want to go? Of course, the plantation system was somewhat dependent on the premise that people would stay, keeping the land there in the hands of the plantation owner and cohesive as a planting machine. But everyone was sick and tired of it. 704 adults and 260 children had died in that 10-year period that are noted. More than half. $600 or more packed up and left. Simply walked off the plantation en masse with their minister. These are the people that were known as the Menorcans. And they were named the Menorcans because some of them, perhaps a great many of them, came from the Spanish island, the Caribbean island of Menorca, when in fact they came from all over the region, including Cyprus. Some of them weren't even Mediterranean. Some of them were Irish. So when this walkout happened, Turnbull came back to his plantation, but at that point was already in financial trouble. This just completely ruined him. He wasn't able to make his bond payments. He lost the land and he ran to Charleston to hide. He died broke. In 1792. So these Menorcan refugees, as we call them, sought refuge and permission from the then governor of Florida, Patrick Tonya. Could they come and settle in a region? And could they have an area where they, as Catholics, could bury their dead on sanctified land? They were given that right. They were given the right to bury their Catholic dead at the Tolamato mission. From some people's perspective, this is when the truly Catholic, civilized portion of Tolamato mission being used as an official cemetery began. I guess we're just supposed to overlook all the indigenous that had been laid there from time immemorial. The Menorcan population is as vital to St. Augustine, really, still to this day, as the heritage of Menendez de Avila and Ponce de Leon. The names of many of the families that are laid to rest in Tolamato are all over not only this city, but this region. The Pachettis were farmers and builders of homes and roads. The Leonardis had stores. The big historic Leonardi store is 2 blocks from my house. The Pellicer family were also builders of homes and carpenters. And there is a creek south of here, a big, beautiful creek on a state park that's named after the gentleman who is buried at Tolamato, the patriarch, Pellicer Creek. The new bridge from the St. Augustine side to the Villano Beach side of the Coast Road is named after the Assini family. The Benet family owned stores. The Ponce family were business people. Also, Oliveros, Lopez Acosta, and Hernandez. $10,000 plus descendants of these refugees live in St. Johns County. And there is still the Menorcan festival that happens every May. We're coming up on May. I have to go. Father Campa was the Menorcan Catholic priest who traveled with them from Turnbull Plantation, negotiated their grant to stay in St. Augustine and use Tolomano Cemetery, and actually wrote a book called The Golden Age of Menorcans. He stayed for 10 years back in the Turnbull area, the New Smyrna area, trying to get all of the people that wanted to get off the land, and ministering to those that were sick. So 10 years later, he made it up, and then he passed away in 1790 and was buried in the chapel, one of the chapels, which had been burnt and rebuilt and burnt and rebuilt. The chapel that we see today was rebuilt for the internment of Father Varela, the Cuban who is on his way to sainthood. That was rebuilt in 1853. Now, what stands as the Tolomano Cemetery today is 1 acre. There are well over 1,000 burials known on that acre, but only 112 are marked. To say that this is hallowed ground is an understatement. The first Catholic burial occurred there in 1798, and that was a visitor from Philadelphia, a 16-year-old woman by the name of Elizabeth Forrester, in an above-ground vault, which was common in the South, and especially here in St. Augustine, where we're surrounded by water. Water tables are high, flooding is common. This began the first Catholic public burial on the land. Of course, Father Campa had been buried in 1790. The Menorcan business people of the Ponce Reyes family, John and his wife, Mary Ponce Reyes, were buried in the 1870s. The second run of yellow fever hit St. Augustine in the 1880s, and there are yellow fever burials there as well. Jorge Villaso, I probably said that wrong, was America's first Black general. He was Haitian and passed in 1801. He was the leader of the Haitian Rebellion. His home at 42 St. George Street is on the historic registry. I think I have a photo in the slideshow. In 1796, he was the second highest paid officer in St. Augustine. And thus, this cemetery has become a pilgrimage place for many Haitians. The ambassador to Haiti, Raymond Joseph, donated a bench to Bissot's memory, which you will see when you see shots of the chapel at Tolamato Cemetery. There's a bench in front there. You can see the bench, and that is in Bissot's memory, since he was buried at a time when markers were wooden and has since deteriorated. So he's there, but we don't know where. It is the bench that reminds us. Antonio Pachetti was the mayor of St. Augustine and noted for harboring the escaped Confederate Secretary of War and former Vice President John Breckinridge in his Cuban family home. He passed away in 1877. Again, very noted name here in St. Augustine. Roads, farms, very noted. Governor Enrique White passed in 1811. He was an Irish-born Spanish soldier, was governor of West Florida in 1793 to 95, and of East Florida in 1796 to 1801. So during Spanish Florida days, we were divided up into East and West. Now, in November of 1877, a freshly 5-year-old James Morgan was playing in a tree that was bordering what was then the cemetery, and he fell, unfortunately, to the ground and broke his neck. He lived across the street. People have spoke of his ghost ever since. There are lots of ghosts here at the Tolamato Cemetery. Here's another story. In the early 19th century, fear of being buried alive was a very common concern. And in 1821, a Colonel Joseph Smith was sent to St. Augustine on assignment. Shortly afterwards, he met a young couple that he befriended. The young wife became sick and died. Now, the culture at the time in Spanish tradition held that the dead would be placed in a chair and carried on a platform from the church or from the home to the place of burial. Due to his stature and their friendship, the widow of this young woman asked that he, Colonel Smith, be one of the people that watched his wife's corpse to make sure that she stayed in the chair. So as the story goes, Colonel Smith was carefully watching her as she was being paraded down the street, kind of a morbid version of a second line, I guess. And as they came around the corner to Tolamato Cemetery, she was run under the Apopanax tree, which is a thorny tree, sweet myrrh gum, very thorny. And the story goes that the thorns scratched her face and she started to bleed profusely. Well, of course, Colonel Smith was watching her. If she was dead, had been dead for days, it's not likely that she would have been bleeding profusely. So he had everyone put the platform down, shocked everyone, and encouraged that she be taken home and cared for. That was done. She revived and lived 6 more years. It is also said that her ghost walks around. She ultimately was buried there, though I can't find any mention of her name. There's also a variety of interpretations of that story. Depends, I suppose, if you're reading what the ghost tours talk about, of course, you know, to sell tickets, they have to make everything as salacious as possible. The belief that this young woman was having an affair with Colonel Smith, whatever, I don't know, I don't care. It is believed that she's still there. People also supposedly see the ghosts of Father O'Reilly, Bishop Vero, and our saint-to-be Marilla walking around in their friar attire and stately attire. So again, the Pellicer family, the patriarch, X.L. Pellicer, carpenter, large farm, the man for whom Pellicer Creek is named, the expansive creek that blends with the Matanzas River down in what is Flagler County, off the land of the place called Prince's Place. Very important historical story in St. Augustine. Perhaps that will be another video. Place where there is an artesianal well and is the first concreted, formally artesianal swimming pool in Florida. This family is noted with helping maintain the grounds still to this day. Jane Masters, a Menorcan, you see here, somewhere is her stone, passed in 1855. The Benet family had stores. They have an entire family section with obelisks. Something that's also interesting here is there was pyramid ossuaries, and some believe that the ones at Tolamato were similar to the ones we are told stand in the federal cemetery on St. Francis Barracks, that we are told were used to hold the bones of 1,400 slaughtered soldiers from the French Indian Wars. No one really knows. I certainly don't think that that's what the pyramids in the federal cemetery are. But you will see there's a photo of Tolamato Cemetery with one ossuary, and then the pyramids, the Dade pyramids that are at the federal cemetery as well. Another subject of another video. There is also a space where there are the stones of 10 Confederate soldiers. 2 sisters of St. Joseph were laid to rest in 1867. Now, all cemeteries in St. Augustine closed in 1884, the second run of yellow fever. Not only were they getting crowded at the time, but people were just afraid of having the internments of fresh yellow fevered bodies within the city walls. And that's when the Evergreen Cemetery opened, which is in the west portion of St. Augustine, West King Street. I did a couple videos of walking around the abandoned Black cemeteries that are behind Evergreen Cemetery just the other day. And I have a video about Evergreen Cemetery as well. In my video where I talk about how the reset as evidenced through the changing of timelines through the inconsistency of headstones is evidenced in old cemeteries. And I walked around some old cemeteries here to show example of that. Now, when the cemeteries were closed due to the yellow fever outbreak, there were people who had either through their Catholic relationship or some kind of familial or even business obligation had plans to continue to be buried in Tolamato when the time came. And there were people that did that. They had their families buried, family members buried in Tolamato after the close. I guess the way it went was they wouldn't stop an undertaker from handling this. They wouldn't stop grave diggers from digging the graves and setting the stones and that. They would just let you do it and then charge you a fine. And the fine at the time was $25. I don't know what an mid-1880s $25 would translate to today, but thinking it's quite a bit of money. Now, there were a couple renovations that were done to Tolamato. In 2016, the wrought iron gates and fence that you've seen in some of these photos were built and donated. The designer was Don Schicklin, who was actually descended from some of the people that are buried inside. And Scott Thompson was the wrought iron artist. In 2018, there were some monuments that were renovated, marble monuments. The first burial of the 16-year-old young woman of the Forrester family was renovated, and the Benet family obelisks were renovated. This was done by Old World walls and ceilings. The Catholic Diocese continues to maintain the cemetery along with support from the Pellissier family and the Tolamato Cemetery Restoration Foundation. The interior of the Marilla Chapel was restored in 2014. And for those people who like to grid things out, the Tolamato Cemetery sits at north 29 degrees, 53.834 minutes, and west 081 degrees, 18.889 minutes. So there is all the words. Let's go ahead and see what we can talk about here. Photos. Sanchez family. I never like to spend a lot of time focusing on the names of buried people. I feel like that's a military burial. Kind of feel like they're not here. I'm not sure what that is. It's next to a very old stone. I tend to think it indicates not that there's someone buried underneath there, but that it was some kind of wall support for an enclosure. Now, I photographed this stone before. This was in my video about how the timeline reset can be evidenced by old headstones. Let me pop out of the slideshow real quick. Oh, well, okay. I wanted to make it bigger. And to do that, I had to get out of the slideshow. But that brought me back to the beginning. Okay, so let's do it this way. So I don't have a date on this drawing, but this is supposed to be indicating Father O'Reilly working with the Timucuan and the Gull at the Cathedral. This is an old map of St. Augustine during the Spanish period, 1700s. Here's the Castillo San Marcos. This where it says church, this is where Nombre de Dios, where Menendez de Avila was supposed to set foot first. This fort up here, Negro Fort, became known as and is still now today Fort Mose, though the star fort that was there is underneath the marsh. Though if you look at my video on Fort Mose, you will see that you can see the points of the remains of the marsh on Google Earth. This over here, Indian Town, this is what we now call Lincolnville. This is where St. Benedict the Moor Church and School were, the first Black Catholic school, boarding school, that ultimately was started because of Bishop Vero and the Sisters of St. Joseph, the same sisters that in the 1900s were jailed for breaking Florida law and being white and teaching Black children. This is the Matanzas River. This would have been the Cubo line, and this was the Rosario line that made the fortified city. Tolamato Cemetery at the time was right outside the wall. This is the Basilica, King Street. The Bridge of Lions now crosses this body of water. Yes, we had another star fort here in St. Augustine. And where it once stood is now some officer in the National Guard's riverfront property. This photo shows, we are to believe, Saturawa, the Timucuan leader, talking to one of the French Huguenots, and you can see he's much taller. They were also very, very tattooed. They were tall and tattooed. Here's a map, and let's see. This one is credited with being from 1763. The map before this, 1675. This Spanish map shows this is outside the city, inside the city, and 17 demarcates what became Tolamato Cemetery, Our Lady of Guadalupe at Tolamato, outside the city wall. There was a moat and earthworks wall that was covered with Spanish bayonet, as they're called, cactus, that was supposed to be 6 to 8 feet tall, that in time was reinforced with logs and made much larger. And the moat was cleared. But this is supposed to be a representation from 1763, outside the city gates, but sanctioned to be there nonetheless. This indicating a bastion of some sort. Based on this, it should be the Castillo. but it could be the point where the Cuba line met the Rosario line, in which case it's flipped. This should be over here. But anyway, I digress. This is a lovely old photo of Castillo San Marcos looking north along the Matanzas River. Look at that seawall. Coquina Fort. Just some relativity. That looks pretty different now. Down here is where the current Fountain of Youth is, where the abomination of the Great Cross stands, Nombre de Dios, the old jail, all that good stuff. And now we have some photos from the cemetery itself. Again, I don't like to focus on people's names that are buried in cemeteries. I don't feel like I have their permission to use their names. In the case of people who have become noted as examples of history for one reason or another, I don't mind that, but I don't like to focus on people's names. Some of these are photos that I took when I was there last Saturday during open hours. An above ground crypt showing you how people were buried. This is one of the row of 10 Confederate officers. All of their stones have this marking and shape. I'm not going to focus on their names. We have some more above ground. There you see the Marilla Chapel in the background. Again, well over 1,000 people on 1 acre of land. Only about 112 are marked. Every step you take is on a soul's resting place. And I edited these photos to highlight age and workmanship, not so much people's names. A lot of restoration. You see that one was actually broken in half at some point. That one was broken in half and restored. The archaeologist of me loves ruins. You know, this one was interesting. When I was walking around the freed slave cemeteries, the black cemeteries over in West St. Augustine, the live videos I did, it was tradition in African and Caribbean cultures to plant a tree at the head of a burial or within the family enclosure of a burial and surround it with stones. Of course, these were Catholic Menorcans for the most part, but not all. There are freed slaves buried here too, but I'm just interested in this tree and its relationship to this crypt. These beautiful ironworks mark enclosures for individuals or from families. So someone's in there. There's a family in there, at least 2 people. That's nice. So much after the fact, someone paid for a stone to commemorate who was there. We have a beautiful marble one there. And this fantastic piece of coquina marking another burial. This is the enclosure for the Hernandez family, a Menorcan family. Beautifully restored. Beautifully restored. Again, another family enclosure. I'm not sure which family this one is attributed to. showing damage from the flooding, and all of Florida basically is an artesianal well. St. Augustine floods, has a creek that has been filled in that was once part of the city wall. The San Sebastian River behind of it, the Matanzas River in front of it. Lots of flood damage here. This is a photo, the date of which I am not given, but this is a photograph of this black and white photo that is standing under plexiglass at the cemetery itself, showing you an old view of the monuments in ruin and the old Marilla Chapel. Beautiful. I was not able to find out where this person went. And there, what remains of her resting place is. If you are interested to find out more, I am told that the Archdiocese of St. Augustine has all of the records. That was poor Mrs. Masters. You can see that damage there. Not only was there water damage, but there's a tree root. Again, trees. Beautiful. And I love that a tree was planted right behind him. See? And he's in an enclosure. Love that. Mickler, another Menorcan family. See, many of these are on the edges where the trees are. What does that mean? Were the trees planted to commemorate eternal life, as in the African and Caribbean traditions, or did the trees just grow? I'm not sure. Husband and wife there. That's a big vault with a husband and wife. Big standing brick vault. And this is part of the Benet family, who suffered greatly during the second yellow fever outbreak. They had 10 children and they lost most of them in a very short period of time. And fortunately, their stones have been restored. It's part of the Benet family. There you see the Marilla Chapel and the bench dedicated to General Bissou. Husband and wife. Again, after the fact, a stone was added. I think that's where we started before. Yep, that's where we started before. And this is the one that I wanted to talk about. So this stone was in my video about the timeline shift. And let's see if I can. You see, this person passed away in, what does that say? Is that 1874? Or is it 874? Look at the spacing of the numbers. Is that an I? or a 1. (2022) AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, 2200. In the year of Ayusha, 874. 2022 AD, I, 874. The AD's in front instead of behind. Start looking at the old cemeteries around you. You'll find the same thing. Might be an I, might be a J, might be a 1 that is shoved in to the space between the date of the death and the year of 17 or 18 that doesn't fit. I'll just leave that there. Beautiful. I basically went over all that, but that's the historical marker. And you can look that up if you like. Beautiful. The Marilla Chapel. Lovely old photo. After a storm, lots of flooding. Typical tropical storm Florida scene, that. Summer shot. Grass is dead. It's what things look like now, pretty much. The Benet obelisk from the Benet family. This was, let's see. Oh. Rousseau's house. There's the book about that rebel bishop who was an advocate for the abolition of slavery. How dare he, that brought the Sisters of St. Joseph to teach the Blacks and the Indians. How dare he? Another shot of him, the Archdiocese of Savannah and St. Augustine. That's the old fence before the renovation. Looks so much nicer now. This now is a restaurant called the Bar Harbor Cheesecake Factory. Where you can get one of, I think 20 different kinds of cheesecake. Mary Ponce, another Menorcan descendant. Lovely detail of the old wrought iron. It's Father O'Reilly's house, which is now a museum, which became the first church school office of the Sisters of St. Joseph. This is the oldest burial, a young 16-year-old woman who passed away, showing after the renovation and before. And this is supposed to be, now that's the light at the chapel, but this is supposed to be very indicative of the orb of her ghost. That's where her crypt is. Fountain of Youth. Yeah, Fountain of Youth. It's near here. an old example of that silly body of water. All of Florida is artesianal water. Everything is the fountain of youth in Florida. It is believed that there was a relationship between this water, the fountain of youth, and the actual placement of the Tolamato Mission and Cemetery. Doesn't take too much imagination to imagine that they're on the same artesianal line. They probably are. Just toss that in for fun. This is the crypt of Father O'Reilly, the first Catholic priest, the Irishman who was ordained in Spain. Another shot of his home and museum. A restored crypt. There's Father O'Reilly. So we believe. Crypt restoration. So here's one of those mysterious pyramid-shaped ossuaries, where the belief is that the bones were collected from an earlier place after a lot of deterioration, obviously, and then placed in this monument without any marking. The same thing we are led to believe that explains these three pyramids in the St. Francis Barracks National Cemetery that stand on the same latitude as the three pyramids in Giza that are 11 feet on each side wide and 8 feet tall, along with an obelisk on the same latitude as the Giza pyramids. Yes, we're supposed to believe that these are just funerary monuments, the same way you're supposed to believe the Great Pyramid is just a funeral monument. Excuse me while I cough. And I just toss this in for fun because I spend a lot of my time looking at old maps, old photos. Not really very relevant to what we were talking about today, but that's one of the early seawalls. That's the Castillo San Marcos right there. So this is looking south. This is one side of King Street. On the other side of this wall is the other side of King Street. And what became the Tolomano Cemetery is not in the photo, but I just like old photos. It gives so much relevance, I think. And this is an example of the city gates after they were restored, being changed from what were called lines, where they were earthenworks that were topped with cactus, and changed into coquina and wood fortifications. This is the St. George City Gate on the Kubo line. So before the coquina lines were built, there was a moat, and then the earthworks. It was outside of this line, the Kubo line, where at the time, Tolamato would have been. After the rebuilding of the gates and the filling in of the moat, the restoration of the lines were actually placed on the other side of Tolamato Cemetery. So Tolamato Cemetery is inside the city gates now. There's a lovely photo at night. These are the 10 Confederate soldiers See the Marilla Chapel, just lovely. If you're looking for thoughts about haunting, maybe you can see something there. A little bit about the importance of the Menorcans. Again, the Spanish just seemed to need to degrade everything. The island of Majorca is M-E. They have to degrade everything. Oh, that's Turnbull. The man responsible for that horrible plantation. But he went broke. Find solace in that. So just wanted to quickly, there's the island of Menorca. Okay. Izmir, if I read correctly, is now what would have been Smyrna at the time. So folks from all of the Mediterranean, including Crete, including Cyprus, Greece, all throughout Italy, took advantage of Turnbull's offer to come and enslave for 9 years. And this is just a cool photo of the Menorcan festival from, I think, a couple of years ago. Orange and St. George. The Menorcan quarter encompasses a part of the colonial part of St. Augustine known as Charlotte Street. And that's just in a few weeks. Felix Varela and his chapel. His chapel. This is supposed to be the most haunted place in St. Augustine. I'm sure I didn't tell all the stories. There's a close-up. There's the bench for General Bissou. This is a detail on the chapel indicating the immortality of time. And this is a plaque in Spanish that's a dedication that is impossible to read at this point. And the new gate, the chapel, and there's the stamp. On his way to sainthood. So that's it. Thank you for hanging out with me again for this long roll down more than you ever wanted to know or care to know about the Tolamato Cemetery. And just like in any case, the fact that I went investigating what I did, oh my gosh, I have pages and pages and pages and pages and pages of notes I didn't even use, but they will spark other stories for videos to come. Thank you again to Michelle Gibson for sharing my videos and bringing so many of you, my new viewers, to watch my videos. I'm honored and delighted that you enjoy my work and have the patience to withstand these long, drawn out videos that I do. So thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is my nerdy passion and I love it. And I love that you love it too. So this is MedusaWasFramed, thanking you for joining me once again, and aloha.